Okay, we'll get started. So again, welcome everyone to the next module in the series for flood education workshop for homeowners and business owners. This particular session is focused on the preparation and mitigation for flooding. So how to protect yourself and your structure from flooding in the first place. My name is Andrea Carson, and I am a community planner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Pittsburgh, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation. We will be talking about some important options and resources you can use to prepare and mitigate against flooding events. And we'll also be sharing with you how you can find this information so that you as a homeowner or a renter or a business owner has access to it and can act on it. The information presented here today is meant to serve as best practices surrounding flooding concerns in Allegheny County, and we'll be providing those helpful tips and resources. But this webinar is not intended to serve as official guidance or instructions, but best practices that we all are here to share with you this evening. Now, this webinar series has been pulled together by a series of workshop partners, and those include the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority, Three Rivers Wet Weather, the Allegheny Conservation District, and the Watershed of South Pittsburgh organization. Before we dive into the materials, I'd like to take a moment to introduce my team. So as I said, my name is Andrea Carson, and I am a community planner for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Pittsburgh District. And I am joined here today with three other presenters. And next, I'll have Carolyn introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Benish with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and I'm also the lead in Pennsylvania for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is the HMGP. Good evening.
Thanks, Carolyn. And then next we'll have Brian.
Good evening. My name is Brian Schimmel. I work for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection in the Southwestern Regional Office. We cover Allegheny County and a number of other counties in the southwest corner of the state. And excited to share some flooding information with you all tonight, and look forward to it.
Great. And last but not least, Annie.
Hi everyone, I'm Annie Quinn. I'm the program manager at Three Rivers Wet Weather. We deal a lot with the sewers that flow under your street, but and municipality partnerships with Alkazan. But today I'm excited to talk about all the other aspects of wet weather for the region.
Thanks, Annie. And so my team here today will be sharing again on information for preparation and mitigation for flooding. And so what I first wanted to do was kind of set the stage for why did we choose to talk about preparation and mitigation. And so one of the things that we focus on in the floodplain management, flood risk reduction world is this flood risk management life cycle. Now the life cycle kind of has certain phases, as you can see here. There is a preparation and training phase, and then there's an event, right? So we want to prepare and train everyone for before a flooding event, and then maybe an event happens. And then after the event, there is a response phase, a recovery phase, and then there's a mitigation phase that leads right back into that preparation and training. And so you'll notice that if you were looking at the titles of all of our webinars in this series, that we follow the theme of this flood risk management life cycle. And so today, the previous sessions that you've sat in on have been part of that preparation and training component. And so what we're going to do today is finish that last piece of preparation and then also focus on mitigation. So when we talk about preparation, those are often actions that are taken before the event. And that might include your planning, your training. And as we've said, you've talked a lot about that. You've learned how to know whether you're in a floodplain, what kind of flooding you can expect to see in your area. That's all part of the preparation and training phase. And so the third component of preparation is about taking care of things ahead of time, putting warnings into place, and those types of actions. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And then when we talk about mitigation, what we want to focus on is driving down the risk. So activities that prevent a disaster. such as flooding. And really focusing on the reducing its chance of happening or reduce its damaging effects. And so examples of mitigation, which we'll go into significantly more later on in this presentation, might include mitigation plans or identifying future structures that you can invest in to put into place, or developing whole system improvements within your watershed. And so that's why the bulk of this presentation will focus on that this evening. And as you can see then, the next two sessions will focus on the responding and the recovering from flooding. And so ultimately, since we're focusing on this preparation and mitigation, these are the questions that we're hoping to answer today for you. What can I do as a homeowner or business owner to mitigate against flooding? If I do something on my own, what do I need to know? And then what options can I pursue if I can't mitigate against flooding on my own? Who can help? So that's where we're really going to focus and kind of how we've broken out this presentation this evening. As I have mentioned, this will be recorded, and similar to the previous modules in this webinar series, we will be providing a resource packet for you. So all of the tools and resources that we mentioned throughout this presentation will be provided to you so that you have that as a reference moving forward for any of your mitigation needs. So before I get started, I promised that this would be interactive. So I want to have you share with us in the chat box now, what steps have you already taken to reduce flooding impacts to your home or business? What do you know about mitigation options? So if you can take a second to type into the chat box what steps you've already taken, that will give us a sense of where we can start and what familiarity you already have. So I see that Annie was sharing that she researched flood insurance after last week's presentation. Absolutely. 1-inch trash pump with 50 feet of hose to discharge the water. Harry, it'd be interesting to see if that's discharge your water from your basement. Is that what you're looking for? I know I recently had a basement backup, and so I've been doing my own research on how to do backwater valves so that I don't have that again in my own home. All right, looks like Daniel put some stormwater boxes in the yard to detain water. Carolyn elevated, fantastic, okay. And Georgette regularly clears the grate on her streets from leaves, absolutely. And so I'm glad to see that there are a wide range of different mitigation options that all of you have taken. And I think that's one of the things that you're gonna see here today. What we're gonna talk about is that all of these actions that you've already taken are all steps to reduce your flood risk. And so when we talk about flood risk reduction actions, what we're talking about are actions that are intended to reduce the likelihood or potential of adverse consequences of a future flood. So that could include, reducing the likelihood of the flood hazard. It could reduce your exposure to it or reducing your vulnerability. And so you'll see that some of your actions fit into each of those categories. But the way that we've structured our presentation for the evening is that we're going to talk about actions that you can take to your home or business. Oh, skipped ahead, got excited. To your home or business, and then transition to what you can do on your property or in the properties nearby. And so that would be an example of what Georgette was talking about with cleaning out some of the grates. And then we're also going to talk about what your community can do within the larger watershed to invest in some flood mitigation measures. All right, and so with that, we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to talk about actions that you can take to your home or business. So I'm going to turn the presentation over now to Carolyn from FEMA to tell you a little bit more about what you can do to your home or business. Carolyn, take it away.
Thanks, Andrea. In this section, we're going to discuss mitigation actions for your home or business, as most actions can be used for both. This is a photo of the Millvale flooding event on July 5th, 2018. It was caused by a slow-moving storm which affected over 400 homes and businesses and caused significant damage. Next slide. Did you know flooding causes more costly damage than any other natural hazard? For every dollar you spend on mitigation, how much do you think it would save you? And put your answer in the chat box, please.
So Carolyn, I see someone took a guess at $10.
No other guesses?
Are we going by whoever gets closest without going over? Georgette has $1,000. That's her guess.
Next slide.
Alrighty.
If you said $6, you're correct. It could be $8 or up to $7 more if you have a homeowner or a business or the community is doing mitigation, which will help everybody. It goes up all the time. So obviously the costs right now for remodeling after a storm, wood is very expensive. So I think at this point, it probably would be more than that. Next slide. Where does water come into your home? First thing I'd like to do is for you all to look at your own house. Walk around your house. Where does the ground meet your house? If you've been flooded before, how high did the water come? Look down at the ground and see how high. Do you have any cracks? Do you have doors or windows below the ground line or flood line? Where else could water get into? Now go inside your lowest level, which could be your basement or a crawl space. Where are the drains? Where's your water and sewer lines, your dryer vents? If you have been flooded in the past, did it reach your washer and dryer, your furnace, water heater, or any of your stored items? I am not in a floodplain, but I'm in the low point of my development. In 2011 storms, it was raining so hard, the water came in along my well pipe and along my electrical lines going to my electrical box, places I never expected. Next slide. These are major actions that we may be able to take if you are flooded. It all depends on how severe you have been damaged. We will also discuss some mitigation actions you could take before you are flooded. To do any of the following, talk with your township or borough. They will be able to help you. Acquisition. Different programs fund this action. Funding sources will be discussed later in our module. These programs will buy your property at fair market value and remove them from the floodplain, and it will remain open space in perpetuity to avoid further damages. Relocation. Your home can be relocated to another location out of the floodplain. It could be even on your own property if some of your properties out of the floodplain. Elevation, to raise your home above the 100-year flood level. This option is available for funding where you can elevate your home yourself using increased cost of compliance, which is a benefit of your NFIP insurance, which helps $30,000 worth, but now discussions are being held to raise this dollar amount to $60,000. Basement abandonment is where your second floor becomes your first floor. Next slide. These are elevation examples. The first picture is Pittsburgh house being lifted for elevation, and the blue house shows before and after pictures. Costs vary by how large your home is and how high you need to be elevated to be above the base flood elevation. Next slide. This is the combined resistance and resilience measures. This will keep water out or possibly save items that are valuable to give you much time to move your belongings to a higher floor. To make mitigation actions easier to visualize, here's a picture of a home showing different types of actions you can take. The best picture I could find was from England, so a few words may sound different from what we use. And I'm going to point out a few. And there'll be, next slide, we have them circled for you. Sewer backwash or backflow valve, next slide. Separate your electrical circuit for upper and lower floors. And at the bottom, electrical sockets, raise them please, because that will make difference if the water can get in. Next slide. Boiler moved to upper floor. This is for all your utilities, or they could be raised on the outside, somewhere outside the flood zone. Next slide. Sentimental and important items kept upstairs, or move them to a higher floor. This could be high shelves. Your TV also can be put up on the wall. Next slide. Raise your kitchen appliances and cabinets. Next slide. Sump pump. Next slide. We'll go to the garage. White goods. These are named for white appliances, which may be your freezer or extra refrigerators, but also any stored items, and all must be elevated. Next slide. Service vents and air bricks. Air bricks are in a very old house or garage that the bricks have holes in them, so that allows air and water to go in and out. Outside. Next slide, I'm sorry. Flood barriers can protect garages, but move vehicles to higher ground if possible. Next slide. Outside, please use permeable paving surface, which allows water to drain through and move away. It could be gravel, pavers, or porous asphalt. Next slide. Wet proofing is an action allowing water to come in and out. Use only in non-living areas. This allows the inside and outside water to keep equal pressure on the foundation. This pressure is called hydrostatic pressure and reduces the likelihood of wall failure or structure damage. Elevated homes must have vents in their raised foundations to allow this flow. This slide depicts where the base flood elevation is and what elevation you should elevate to, and for the placement of vents. The legend shows the first floor, which is not your basement unless you have a walkout basement. The DFE is your design elevation, where exactly the elevation of the home should be, and your lag is your low adjacent ground level. Next slide. Dry proofing. Seal cracks in foundation walls, doors, and windows with caulking. Install permanent flood roof house doors. Temporary watertight strip seals and coatings around door frames. Keep your gutters cleaned out. Downspouts pointed away from your home. Water from pooling at the corners of your home. Next slide. Action you should take to protect and mitigate damages to your home. Number one, NFIP flood insurance. If you notice in the picture, you would be able to save $90,000 over 10 years if you build 3 feet above the base flood elevation. That's a lot of money for a homeowner. Next slide. Actions continued. Install 1 or more sump pumps with backup batteries. Install a flood alert system, which will allow you time to prepare. Build, mitigate, and repair to code. Check with your local codes officer. And again, move your irreplaceable items, important papers, or family pictures. Next slide. Prepare for a power failure. Buy a generator. There are stationary and mobile units. Be sure it's powerful enough. Gas-powered generators need a well-ventilated area, not in your home. Smaller mobile solar-powered ones can be in your home, and they can even be charged out of your car. Have battery backups for medical equipment and other items. Next slide. Can you think of any others? What would you do? Share with us in the chat box. While you're putting things in the chat box, I'll continue about my flooding experience. During the 2011 storm, with water coming in, I grabbed my cans of expanding foam and it worked, and not even a drop of water came in, and it's still working today. Now, Has anybody put your ideas in the chat room? Andrew, do we have any?
So far, I think people are still thinking about what actions they would take, Carolyn.
Okay. Well, I'll go on with my experience a little bit and say, when I repaired my basement, I used all waterproof materials as much as I could. And I've been lucky, no other flooding to today. We had such a bad storm, but we checked everything, no water came in. I think everybody put their ideas in the beginning.
I think so.
All right, well, let's go on to the next slide. Reference materials. Floodproofing non-residential buildings are intended to help business owners, facility managers, engineers, architects select and implement retrofit measures. FEMA has many books, pamphlets, and guidance on many subjects. There are also how-to and other guides for homeowners. Please see the resource pages for links will be at the end. Next slide. Protecting non-residential and businesses. As we said before, the ones that work for houses most times will work for businesses. Number one, have flood insurance or even private flood insurance for your business. Develop a plan. What will you do? How will you plan for it? Have exercises where you set up barriers, gates and pumps, so when it floods, you can do it fast and easily. Train staff what to do when it floods. Have movable floodgates or walls, barriers for windows and doors, mobile flood pumps and generators. Next slide. Another thing businesses can do is keep water out. Business and owners can seal foundation with rubber coatings or other sealants. Next slide. More options. Protect vulnerable equipment, inventory, and vital files. Elevate your first floor inside with steps to get to the elevated first floor, or move all your critical rooms to higher floors. And then there's emergency measures. Get ready, be prepared with your sandbags, plastic sheeting, create temporary flood wrappings or barriers. Next slide. Thank you all.
So now that Carolyn has told you a little bit about how you could focus on your home or business, we're now going to have Annie Quinn from Three Rivers Wet Weather tell you a little bit about what you can do in the area around your home. Annie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Carolyn, for all that great advice for how we can work inside of our houses to make our belongings and the things we care about protected. But that's not the only place that you can go to look for solutions to flooding. I recommend now that, next slide, we start to think about things as the homeowners from the full property perspective. So to account for your stormwater, there's a couple different types of stormwater I want you to take into consideration. It's where's the water entering your property? And how is your property producing stormwater as well, contributing to the overall system? And there's a really great guide for this that I'm going to walk through as a little activity to do later. It's called the Homeowner's Guide to Stormwater. It'll be included in your resource packet. It walks through this activity in detail and even gives you the graph paper to get it done. Next slide. So the first step of this is just like when you're walking around your property, looking for where there might be entry points and cracks and crevices, like Carolyn was saying. I now want you to walk around your property actually looking at the space itself. Your job here is to be outside, and even preferably outside in a rainstorm, because that is the best time to observe how water moves both onto your property, off your property. It's also helpful to establish where slope, gradient, and surfaces may be that increase or decrease the runoff of your property. So I want you to be looking at it very critically. This is an opportunity for you, maybe since your inspection, to really take a look at every crack, crevice of the actual grass, sidewalk, garage, roof surfaces that you see everywhere. And also stand in your yard. Does it get mushy when it rains? How many areas are covered? How much does your tree cover if you have tree coverage in your property? Where are your downspouts? Where do they connect? based on slope, where might you guess that they go? I want you to memorize as much of this walk as possible. Next slide. Because your goal is then to build a map. I want you to actually draw it out. Now you can either be high tech and do it on graph paper application on your computer, or you can be like me and draw it on a piece of paper physically. But the goal here is for you to use a proportionate representation, because there's a little bit of math later, I'm sorry. But what you're trying to accomplish with this map is to really understand what is your property profile? Where is your garage? Where are the sidewalks? Where is the roof profiles? Where do you connect to the street? Where are all of the grass areas? Do you have a garden? I want you to think about all of those, and I want you to draw them on your map. And now I understand that it might be very hard to exactly calculate what 1 foot is versus 1 square on your graph paper, but it can be really helpful. If that is a little too complicated, also feel free to just proportionally say, well, my house takes up about 1/3 of my property, or my house takes up only a small decimal. My total acreage is here in this very large, vast property. Depending on what that is, I want you to really understand what that might look like. And also keep in mind your natural spaces and possible stream channels. Draw those directly into your map. Your goal with this map is to get a few numbers from it. And one of these you may have to look up elsewhere. I need you to know what your total acreage of land is to complete this activity. And you may have to get that from your inspection or elsewhere, but it's a part of this. Next slide. And the reason we're doing this is that we're trying to account for stormwater. We're trying to account for stormwater that may be entering your property from a nearby slope, and why it might be entering your property from a nearby property, and also what your property contributes to the overall system. Because as good world citizens, it's important for us to understand that each house, each property, each yard is adding into the total system. So it's important while you're making this map for you to think about, where does water puddle? Where is your basement getting damp? And then think about that from the outside yard perspective. So first you thought about with Carolyn about not storing your photos maybe in that section of your basement, but now go outside to that same corner and say, what is occurring at this area? And how can I map that properly with arrows and dimensions that help me best map and understand that water movement on my property? So next slide. I really want to dig in on this runoff idea. And the reason we want to do that is that there's a really important understanding of what runoff is, because a significant amount of flooding occurs because of surface level flooding, as we learned in the first couple workshops, as well as even stream flooding. A lot of times is the runoff of streams. When they don't have their floodplain, the streams are physically running off into your yards. So we're going to run through an activity. So first, Andrea is going to drop a link to an external app in the chat box. If you could, and if you feel comfortable doing so, click on the link and navigate to a new browser tab and open it up. You don't have to do this. You're welcome to just follow along. Next slide. I'm going to show you what this application actually looks like. The cool thing about this is that it involves 3 factors. First, it's your land use. How are you actively using your land? Are you putting large, heavy developments on it, lots of buildings, lots of sidewalks? Are you an open land? Are you a meadow? Are you a desert? We don't have very many of those in Allegheny County, but you never know. You also have different soil profiles along the bottom. Different soils absorb different things. You may know for a fact based on your garden that you have a lot of clay, or may have really sandy property. And in this example, you see the example of a forest. And the 3 big colors are showing you what is runoff, what is infiltration, and what is part of that transpiration, which is trees evaporating. And you can see that based on changing the amount of rain along the top, another parameter, rains a very little, rains very lot, or changing your land type, or changing your soil type, you'll start to see that different types of land uses have different types of runoff. And we learned a lot about this in our first workshop when we talked about watersheds. But it's just a cool application for you to be able to see how that plays out. The reason we're doing this is that your soils on your property and your neighbor's soils upstream from you and your neighbor's use of their property and your use of the property are going to change the profile for you as you look at your runoff and look at how much stormwater may be causing that flooding that you're experiencing. If you live downhill of a farm or downhill of a wetland, you're going to have a very different profile of that runoff and a very different profile of that land use. So if you could, after playing around for a minute, I'll give you a second or two, click around in the application and start to really see where are there very high levels of runoff, a big bar of red, and where are there, a lot more infiltration. Infiltration is often when water has access to soil and can get back to that groundwater table and do what water is meant to do. Just soak through the soils and get back to the groundwater table. So everyone, if you've had a chance and have clicked around while I've walked through the example on the screen and or you are doing it in your own tab, please return back to the Zoom chat. Now, we're going to give you a little test. So based on the example you saw and or based on your own experience, we're going to put up a poll, and it's a bit of a test because this land use is really key to understanding flooding. So Andrea, if you could throw up the poll question.
And actually, I'm going to see if Rebecca, can you help us run this poll? Having some technical difficulties.
Here, let me see if I.
Or Annie, if you can. Yeah.
Let's see. All right, you should see a poll up on your screen. So I apologize. I know none of you were expecting a test today, but I would like to test what land cover you think would be the most likely to have the most infiltration. And remember that definition of infiltration is about avoiding runoff. Runoff is the opposite of infiltration. So let's get some answers. I'll give you a second. And if you're still fiddling around in the app to make sure you're perfectly correct, I always accept that. All right, I see that everyone has participated in the poll. And the good news is you all are spot on. The forests, grassland, and wetlands definitely have the highest profiles. And really, it does depend a bit on the soils, and it does depend on whether you have a hard rainstorm or a small rainstorm. But in general, those three land use types are really, really great at having a lot of infiltration. And as you see from the second question, which land covers likely have the most runoff, which is again the opposite of infiltration, you all guessed very correctly, development that is high. So how does this apply to us, and how does this affect our flooding? Next slide. Because as you're looking at your property and you're really thinking about your property from a holistic perspective, you're really digging on two definitions. And that is what is porous or pervious and what is impervious space. Because on your map, you're now going to start delineating, which means moving and organizing and sorting. Because I want you to start looking at your property as chunks. Are there chunks of your property that are impervious, which are areas in which groundwater, rainwater, runoff are unable to reach the groundwater table or unable to saturate down through the soils? You see it in this image with the forest. You see that 25% of rain that falls in a natural setting is actually infiltrating down through those soils. So I want you to start identifying where are those pervious surfaces. And then the impervious surfaces are areas that are rooftops, garages, sidewalks, patios, even some decks. All of that are considered the impervious surface of your property. And through looking at that and evaluating that, I want you to start to gain an understanding of how much of your property is dominated by impervious surface versus pervious surface. The reason for this is that we have to get to that math part. Next slide. Now, I apologize that we have to actually do some math associated with this, but the reason we do this is because it really allows us to understand our own contributions and what's happening up our watershed from us. So let's take, for instance, that you are actively contributing with a certain amount of acreage and a certain amount of impervious surface, which are the two numbers you need for these calculations. And this will be in the sliding recording later for you to run through the exercise, that you're going to multiply it by a couple unit changes shifts. We learned about that, and when we were in middle school, about how to get from one unit to another, from gallons to acres, acres to gallons. You need to do a bit of multiplication, but through that process, you're able to then understand based on the square feet of impervious area. Let's say you have about 3,000 square feet of impervious area of your roof, your garage, your sidewalks, your patios, that you're contributing, your house alone is contributing 1,869 gallons of runoff. That is a lot of water. That is bathtubs and bathtubs and bathtubs full of water. And the reason I want you to understand that is think about where you live. Think about every house that's uphill from you, and then start to multiply each of those houses by the number that you generated as you did this activity, and start to understand even that first week when we talked about mapping your watershed and understanding how big they might be, even bigger than you maybe understand or expect them to be based on terrain and geography. But using that in multiplication, start adding up how much water is flowing down this system toward your house. Start thinking about the pipes that are under the street, how they may be only fitted to understand a dry weather system. Maybe they're not capable of handling 1,869 gallons times 48 houses. So that's where basement backups come from. That's where stormwater runoff flooding comes from. And often think about 1,800 gallons of water flowing into a nearby stream. That's your contribution to that local stream's capacity issues. Now, I don't want you to get distraught or depressed by learning this, but it's because we as a system can learn holistically how we can create solutions that allow us to move forward and make us all good citizens in our society. Next slide. And that's because there are real solutions to this where you can remove your stormwater. And then if we work as a community, we can start removing the source of flooding from your house, right? So some of those examples are rain barrels. Rain barrels are where you disconnect your downspout and allow you to put that water into a secured storage space. And then you use it later when it's not raining to water your garden or to use in other areas around your property. These are all called best management practices, by the way. They are sometimes referred to as shorthand as BMPs. And why do we call them best management practices? Because they are the best technology that we've come up with to date, that science has developed, that allows us to cure these problems. So we have to look at them as the best option at the time. And so if I was looking for a solution, I would certainly want the best one. So these other BMPs include downspout disconnects. They can be quite artistic. It's important though that you're conscientious about where you're pointing that disconnect and also where you're pointing your downspout. And we'll get to that on the next slide, that there are some really cool options for you to point that water at from your roof to save it from going in places it shouldn't be. Another great option, and I actually saw someone in the chat said that they've installed these. So you're already ahead of the game in the fact that you've put porous pavers in your driveway. An incredible way of removing your probably one of the largest contributions of stormwater other than your roof is your driveway, and removing those large impervious surfaces and replacing them with pavers. They can be quite beautiful, and as well as remove the stormwater from that impervious area on your map. And then I also saw someone said they put in a riparian buffer. So you all are probably experts about all these green infrastructure techniques already. Green infrastructure is often just replacing our gray versions of sidewalks and streets with greener versions that kind of mirror and mimic nature. Riparian buffers are an example of that. Putting trees back along streams can really help establish a stable bank, which can help the stream navigate its floodplain better. Next slide. And another example, and some of the ones you probably have heard of, are rain gardens and green roofs. These are, again, BMPs. And a rain garden, I don't want you to be scared away. Often it's just a contoured garden. It's a sunken garden. The goal of a rain garden, yes, it can be designed by an engineer. It can be a stamp seal designed thing. It can be expensive and it can be something a contractor puts in. But often you as a regular homeowner have the capability and the ability to put these things in. A rain garden really is, like I said, a contour and sunken garden that allows rainwater to be trapped for a little bit and allows the plants to act as those little straws that they can be and remove that stormwater from the system, eliminating from the overall system that's causing the flooding. So rain gardens, green roofs are just a way of elevating a rain garden and putting it on top of a building so that that runoff is no longer in your calculation. Now that you've done the math and you really understand that impervious versus pervious, it's really about how can you remove the impervious and add more pervious space into your property. Next slide. And if all of this sounds incredibly far-fetched and hard to achieve, I just want you to know that viewing it from the watershed perspective and saying my 1,800 gallons stops here, through mitigation efforts that I've done on my property, it has already been put into practice right here in the region. So I know it's a little outside of Allegheny County, but there is a project that's in Mount Pleasant, which is on Route 31 out in Westmoreland County, where a group of neighbors were experiencing intense flooding. And if one person had installed a rain garden, it wouldn't have probably made that big of a difference. But because they were viewing things from the watershed perspective, and because they acknowledge each person's contribution up the line, they were able to work with their municipality and their conservation district, and they were able to get federal and state funding to put in 20 rain gardens. So each property got a beautifully designed garden. View it from the silver lining of installing beautifully landscaped yards into 20 properties. Of course, there was some sneaky stormwater management involved that allowed them to eliminate the flooding from the neighborhood because of this holistic watershed perspective where multiple individuals were involved. There was a small contribution from each house, but the majority of funding came from those grants. So this is possible, and it's already happening in our region. And it doesn't mean we cannot look at our whole watershed in that perspective and start viewing our neighbors as in this together to help address stormwater and flooding. Next slide. And then while I'm here, the last thing I just want to say is to remind you that if you don't have the money to put in a rain garden, I understand. I often find myself to be budget strapped. If you don't have the ability to throw seeds on your roof and suddenly have a green roof, I understand that these practices can be very expensive, but I just want to remind you that there is an instant flood control technique that you can do today. The instant flood control technique you can do is that you can help our infrastructure actually function. There is a huge part of our pipes and systems that can't access the water that it is meant to drain away. And that is because of leaves and trash that is accumulated on those grates. So your job is to go out and either look upstream or downstream of your house and look for that stormwater entry point where your downspouts may be going. Where is that? Where does your street runoff head? Look for those drains and make sure that they're intact, the grates are in good condition, and that there aren't leaves and debris on top. I am not asking you to reach inside, please. The goal is not to hurt yourself. We are not looking for clowns here, people. Our only job is to just make sure that the water can get from the surface to the pipes where it is allowed to be removed from the system. So taking your 1,800 gallons and making sure that if it does get off your property, that when it does, it can actually access the pipes itself. And there's a whole bunch of different techniques you can use to make sure this is successful, including running while you pick up trash, collection events. Check out Allegheny Greenways, check out Allegheny, trash removal programs. There's a ton of them out there. And it's just kind of that instant way that you can address flooding on your property. So I'll throw it back over to Andrea, but I look forward to answering any questions you may have at the end.
Great. Thanks, Annie. So now we're going to move along our spectrum from homes to your yards and property to that final piece about what can be done in the community and watershed. And Annie already kicked us off a little bit with what you can collectively do on your properties. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some watershed scale measures that different organizations can help you take as a community. So oftentimes when we talk about watershed scale measures, we instantly think about bigger projects, a lot of built projects, and they tend to be more structural in nature, or at least a lot of them. And so when they're structural in nature, often what they're doing is rather than reduce the vulnerability or the damage at one particular property, what it's trying to do is reduce the probability of flooding in the first place by changing how the water acts within the watershed. So we'll try to avoid damages by modifying the nature or extent of the flood hazard rather than protecting a particular structure that might be impacted by the flooding, if that makes sense. So oftentimes for these more municipal or watershed initiatives, we'll see that individuals can't tackle them, but it needs to be something that a whole community invests in, or even multiple communities in some cases. And these often require some type of study to make sure that if you're building something in one place, you're not negatively impacting someone downstream. And they can be costly depending on the scope of the measure, which is why in just a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the different assistance that is available for these types of measures. But one of the great benefits of these is that they can often provide greater flood damage reduction benefits against larger volume flood events than we can with the individual actions we might take at our homes. But one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that flood risk management measures, whether they are something like the concrete channel or the levee, the reservoir, or the flood wall that you see here on the screen, all of them work to try to significantly reduce the risk of downstream flooding, but they don't necessarily eliminate the risk of flooding. And so oftentimes we see that these measures, we want to be communicating out to the communities to let them know that they are there, that they do provide some flood risk reduction benefit, but that there is some still existing risk. And that's why we also think being able to empower you to take actions on your own property are so important. Now, hopefully, if you do have one of those in your community, I'd actually love to hear about it in the chat box. We want hopefully your local community is communicating out to you about what that residual risk is, that remaining risk that's available, and what you should be doing in the case that there is a flood that maybe is larger than what your flood risk reduction structural watershed measure is meant to help reduce the risk of. But one of the other things that we also talk about when we talk about flood risk reduction measures at a watershed scale are more of the alert actions, right? So hopefully your community has told you what can happen or how they send out an alarm if there is flooding in that particular area. And in our previous modules, we touched on that as well. But that could also be viewed as a watershed scale measure that your community can implement to reduce that flood risk, which, as you remember from the beginning, is our ultimate goal. But we also have a different watershed scale measure that we know we get a lot of questions about when we go out and talk to communities. So I'm going to bring back Brian from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to tell you a little bit about dredging. And Brian, you're on mute.
Thank you, Andrea. Dredging is removal of sediment, from stream bed, and this is sort of one of the first reactions that a community usually comes to us with after they've had a flooding event. They say, "Hey, there's not enough capacity in that stream channel for the water. That's why we all got flooded." So while dredging is a possibility, you see some photos here of a local project in Allegheny County. It is pretty technical to permit it, and then also it can be very expensive for the municipality or whoever is doing the work in the long term. Dredging, it becomes a continual maintenance issue. The sediment, once it loses the water, loses velocity and drops out the material, it builds up again, and it kind of happens over and over and over unless there is a way to prevent the sediment from getting into the stream channel in the first place from upstream, or to correct what's wrong in the stream in the first place. So dredging is possible, but it is very difficult to permit, as I said. It is temporary. As I mentioned, it fills back in over time, increases bank erosion and flood risks downstream. I think at one of the earlier modules, we learned about floodplains and stream channels and floodways, but the purpose of a floodplain is to let the stream cool off, dissipate its energy, and basically cool down. If you deepen a channel and its banks, are cut off from the natural floodplain, water tends to go faster downstream and can cause, like I said, erosion issues, but also problems for downstream communities. Next. So again, here's just a little chart for folks if it comes up and you get questions about it in your municipality, or you ever want to talk to us about it. These are some of the issues that we will bring up. Anytime you make a change to a stream channel, it's going to result in some pretty big changes. So you want to make sure that anything that is done is engineered properly and has the eventual outcome that you want, and you aren't surprised by what happens, as sort of evidenced by some of these other problems here. Next. This is a guide that'll be in the resource packet that I recommend for everybody on the program here. It tells you when and when you don't need permits to do work in a stream. We put this out a couple of years ago. It's been invaluable. It's sort of set up as a green, yellow, and red light. Green, obviously, you don't need any authorizations from the department to get in the stream. Stuff like removing non-native material, debris, trees, as long as you're not getting any heavy equipment in the bed of the stream. You can use equipment from the side of a stream as long as you're not digging into the bed or the banks. You don't need a permit. But then when you get into some of these other ones, like rebuilding roads and bridges, stabilizing the banks, armoring stream banks, you definitely want to give us a call, reach out, just so we can make sure that you're doing everything in accordance with our permits. And then red light is an obvious, moving a stream, dredging a stream, building dams. Those are the type of things that you definitely want to talk to us first. So this is a great guide. It'll be in the resource packets, and I think it can help answer a lot of those basic questions. So some things you need to know if you're doing these yourselves. Okay, yeah, why do you even need a permit in the first place? So we want to make sure that these structures are built in a way, again, that is permanent, does the job that you want it to do, and it doesn't fail and end up down in someone else's underneath their bridge or in their culvert downstream. I've seen it happen quite a few times. And there is a lot of unpermitted work that gets done, and it ends up usually being troublesome later on. So a permit acts as a record and outlines the maintenance responsibilities of the owner. So if you own a bridge, if you own a culvert or a crossing, you need to keep that free-flowing water able to go through so it doesn't clog up, cause flooding, again, to your neighbors. So our permitting process, a lot of it does require an environmental consultant, just because of the nature of the technical nature of the application process. And other than just DEP, I want to stress that you should also be speaking with your local municipality if you're doing work. As soon as you get near the floodway, the banks, or in a stream, you want to talk with both of us. Now this is a little illustration of that. You can see the municipality is on either side. You want to speak with them, and then as soon as you start getting closer to that stream channel, anything you may you think you may be in that range, you want to reach out to DEP and your municipality to make sure that everything is kosher with their rules and regs. This is just some example. This is an unpermitted stabilization where someone was basically just dumping rock, and as you can imagine, didn't take much than the next rainstorm for all of that to end up downstream under a bridge where where it's not supposed to be. So these are the kind of things we're trying to avoid with the permitting. Another example, these are stream bank walls that were put in some time ago and no permits. So the landowners were saying, hey, who's gonna help us out here with these walls that are falling in? And unfortunately, without a record to show who owns it, if it abuts your property and you against a stream, you are responsible for maintaining that. Again, if that wall causes flooding, you could be held responsible for the outcomes. Here's a properly permitted stabilization project that I just pulled. This gentleman he got a permit to put that block wall in there to protect his home, and he is going to extend it to further protect his pool and patio area. So it can be done properly. We just ask that you check with us, and that's going to last a long time and prevent erosion to his property. As I mentioned before, the locals, they have a floodplain. They may have a floodplain manager, and an ordinance on the books, and any type of development that you're going to be doing in those areas, you want to make sure that you're again in accordance with their guidelines. You may need to get waivers, and you obviously have building in a floodplain. You have the opportunity or chance to be flooded. So who can help you with these actions?
And so with these last couple of slides, as we promised, we wanted to provide you with some access to assistance if you can't, have the funding, or it's a larger scale project that you're trying to take on, or you don't even know where to go in the first place or what to do. And so what we've done here for you is try to summarize some of the more well-known federal and state assistance programs that are available. And so what we've done is we've broken this into two different types. The first type is focusing on flood studies and then perhaps some implementation. And the flood studies are really meant to help you better understand your flooding problem in the first place and what particular actions would be the best actions to take to reduce the flooding that you're experiencing. And so these first set of programs help do that, and then some of them lead to construction. Now, one of the things that you're going to receive in your resource packet is a mitigation resource guide that talks about all the different types of programs that are available, both within the state of Pennsylvania and nationally, so that you can find the right program for you. But these are just some of the highlights. There are other types of programs that also focus on implementation only. And what we have tried to summarize here, just at a broad brush, is that there are some implementation programs that really focus on those individual structures. So if you have a home or business and you want to take some of those major actions that Carolyn was talking about earlier, these are the types of programs in that first column that have the X in the individual structures that can help you do that type of work. Now we also have more of the watershed scale measures. That might be something that is a little bit more like your levee or your retention basin, but it also could be restoring the floodplain. And so anything that is a little bit larger in scale, we put under the watershed measure rather than focusing on the individual structures in the first column. And then the final column here represents those types of programs that really help with the sediment removal or stream bank protection. So if you're seeing a lot of erosion or a lot of sediment buildup, those are the programs that can help you with those. So hopefully that'll give you a taste of where you should go. But again, this isn't comprehensive, but is a way to put you into the right step, if you will. And so I'll say that on behalf of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we often welcome opportunities to collaborate with communities and key stakeholders to understand what they're seeing as their risk and share information as to how to do this. And so similar to our process here, a lot of these programs follow a process where we receive requests from local municipalities. And oftentimes we might get a call from a homeowner or a business owner, but what we do as both state and federal agencies is that we often need to work with the community. So if we receive a call from you as a homeowner, what we'll automatically do is then pick up the phone and talk to the municipality, because that's really at the level that we're able to assist. So what I actually would recommend to you is that if you now have heard about these programs and think that might be of assistance to your community, let your local municipality know that these programs are available and recommend that they reach us, because that's the way that most of our processes work. So if we receive a request from a local municipality, what we'll then do is organize a site visit and come out and talk to the municipal officials. We might even come visit you and your property and have you talk a little bit about what you've been experiencing. I actually was just in McCandless Township today looking at Wexford Run, for instance. And so what we'll do is we'll talk about the problems. We'll try to get a sense of whether our program can fit your municipality's needs. And if that's the case, then we'll pursue our processes a little bit each different for each program, but oftentimes we're requesting funds from that program, and then we're working with the local municipality to have that. There might be a cost share, or we need a sponsor, and so we'll work with them to work that out. Now, some of these programs are granting programs, and some of these programs are cost shared programs, depending on what they are. But most of the time, this process is similar for either one. And so, one of the things, though, that I want to kind of embark on you, or put on you as homeowners and business owners, is that your best course of action is to let your municipal officials know of these programs, but also if you're looking for immediate action, right, to help you with something that you need in terms of mitigation, really using your flood insurance is your quickest and best way to do that. Carolyn earlier talked about the increased cost of compliance as an opportunity for you. And if you do have some flood damage from a previous storm and you're looking for help with your home, your flood insurance is probably your best and quickest bet to deal with your individual flood damage and flood risk reduction for future efforts. But these larger programs can help your community as a whole deal with flood risk mitigation, but it might take a couple years to actually work on that. But as I said, additional information on each program will be provided in your resource packet, so you can learn a little bit about them and figure out which one is the right size for you and for your community. All right, so we are wrapping up at the end, and I just want to recap that we've today shared many different ways to prepare and mitigate against flood damage. We talked about flood proofing, and as you can see, there is many different combinations of structural or non-structural changes or adjustments that you can make to your home, to your property, and to your community as a whole to help reduce that flood risk. We hope that this has been helpful to you and that we've answered some of these questions today about what you can do as a homeowner or business owner to mitigate against flooding, what you can do on your own and what you need to know, and then also what options are available to you if you do need help in pursuing these things. I want to thank you again for your time and attention, and we'll now stop the recording so that we can answer any questions you have. If you have those questions, feel free to type them into the chat box at this time.